Chinese tourists are pouring into Singapore after 3 years of draconian COVID-19 lockdown by the CCP. But there are not as many Chinese tourists as compared to the pre-COVID-19 pandemic days. What is happening to the Chinese economy? Are Chinese tourists running out of money? We are going to discuss this today. Hi everyone! After 3 years of China's COVID-19 lockdown, many countries are looking forward to Chinese tourists to boost the tourism industry. This is especially true for Singapore. China is the largest market for the tourism industry in Singapore, and Chinese tourists are flocking into Singapore. Singapore had 2.9 million tourists from China in the first quarter. Sounds like a lot of tourists from China. But the number of Chinese tourists was only 62% of the total number of Chinese tourists before the COVID-19 pandemic. The Chinese authorities reported that business sentiment in the services and construction sectors was even stronger in March than in February, and we should be expecting more Chinese tourists. I was curious and wanted to know why there are not as many Chinese tourists as before the COVID-19 pandemic. I did a bit of digging. Guess what I found? One of the key reasons we are not seeing as many Chinese visitors is because the Chinese people are running out of money. I also found other compelling statistics that indicate that the recovery of China's economy is not as optimistic as it appears to be. Protests in Zhengzhou city in Henan province erupted again in April the 2nd. The protesters were shouting angrily, demanding that the Chinese banks and the Chinese authorities return their money. Take a look. This is not the first protest. Massive protests first broke out last year after the Chinese banks froze millions of dollars worth of deposits in April. The Chinese banks have no money to return to the depositors. It is not just the banks in the local provinces who are running out of money. The local governments are becoming increasingly cash-strapped and increasingly reliant on the central government for funding. Beijing had transferred more funds to the local government, which had jumped 30% since 2015. Beijing transferred funds to the local governments for education, healthcare, and other general expenses. So far this year, Beijing has transferred funds, which is equivalent to 86% of the local government's revenue. According to market experts, the transfer of funds could continue to rise and exceed 100% of the local government's revenue. Why do the local governments need funding from Beijing? China is facing a huge property crisis, and the local governments are heavily saddled with property debt because there are many unsold apartments due to the weak demand. Around a third of the newly completed apartments last year were unsold, the highest percentage since 2015. These unsold apartments are mostly located in third-tier cities. These third-tier cities have smaller populations and demand is much weaker as compared to major cities like Shanghai and Beijing, which makes these apartments difficult to sell. The local governments are sitting on the unsold properties and ridden with debts. The provincial governments owe a total of around $5.1 trillion, including bonds held by local and foreign investors. Just to give you an idea how huge the debt is, $5.1 trillion is more than the combined government debt of Germany, France, and Italy. The debt also exceeded the income of some of the local governments. 2/3 of the local government's outstanding debt is more than 1.2 times their income, according to S&P Global. About a third of China's major cities are struggling to pay just the interest on the debt they owe. A local government property financing vehicle in Guizhou has defaulted on more than $2 billion worth of loans and restructured the repayment to 20 years. What is worrying is that 84% of the $84.2 billion in offshore debt will mature within the next 3 years. Imagine the local government can't even pay $2 billion worth of debts, and we are talking about a whopping $84.2 billion debt here. China will need to absorb the market's excess housing, which means there could be a prolonged period of slow new home construction. The property market is one of China's biggest growth drivers and job creators, and it is crucial for China's economic recovery. The consumption in China is also in bad shape. Consumption continues to fall in the first 2 months of this year because the unemployment in China has increased. Many Chinese lost their jobs during the 3 years of COVID-19 lockdown, which caused many businesses to close down. The crackdown on the tech industry in China has also forced entrepreneurs to leave the country. Many Chinese have their money stuck in their properties. They have paid off their mortgages and have less cash for spending on consumer goods and services. Social security and employment expenditure had gone up 9.8% last year to 780.5 billion yuan. The Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index, or the PMI, is not looking good either. The PMI fell to 51.9 in March from 52.6 in February. The reason China's manufacturing activities had gone down was because China's exports had fallen 6.8% during the first 2 months. The EU is China's second largest trading partner, and export fell 12.2%, while the US is the third largest trading partner, and export had declined 21.8%. The US and the EU are keeping interest rates high for a longer period to control inflation, which means this country will be buying less from China. The lower exports affected the profits of the Chinese industrial firms. Profits for 28 of 41 major industrial sectors sank for the first 2 months this year due to weak demand and high cost. The most severely affected industries are computer, telecommunications, and other electronic equipment manufacturing, with profits declining by as much as 77.1%. Profits of Chinese manufacturers with annual revenues of at least 20 million yuan, roughly around $2.9 million, contracted 22.9% in the first 2 months of this year. What are the Chinese authorities doing to spur demand? The People's Bank of China, the central bank, will cut the reserve requirement ratio for financial institutions by 0.25 percentage point, the first reduction since December last year. Banks operating in China are required to park a certain percentage of funds with a PBOC, and reducing the reserve requirement ratio will unleash 500 to 600 billion yuan, roughly $72.6 to $87.2 billion of liquidity into the market. Well, my friends, that's all for today. China's recovery is dependent on the recovery of the property sector and the export market. IMF projects a lower economic growth this year at 2.7% as compared to 3.2% last year due to higher inflation, rising cost of living, tightening financial conditions, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the lingering COVID-19 pandemic. It is going to be a rough ride, and I wish everyone the best. If you like the video, please like, subscribe, and share.